You may recall Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, the book about the meatpacking industry. He became the Democratic nominee for governor in the state of California on a program he called End Poverty in California, or EPIC. He called for the government to seize idle factories and land and run them by the government to create jobs. This was very popular. Republicans run the first modern negative campaign. They created fake newsreels of armies of unemployed marching on California and then spread lies that Sinclair had been endorsed by the Communist Party. This is the invention of modern dirty politics. Dirty politics is about as old as politics. But the business owners did this to stop Sinclair from helping the working people of California. Huey Long, who was called the Kingfish, comes out of the populist and socialist movement. He was elected governor of Louisiana in 1928, and then he appointed himself as senator when an open seat came in 1930. He ran Louisiana like a dictator. He did set up roads, schools, and hospitals, and he taxed the hell out of the rich, particularly the oil companies, in a program that he called Share Our Wealth. Every man a king was his slogan. And he ran for president in 1934 on that slogan, saying he was going to tax the rich and give every family in America a house and a job. Huey Long is the first person in this country to seriously propose what today we call universal basic income. Let's pull down these huge piles of gold until there should be a real job, not a little old sow-bellied, black-eyed pea job, but a real spending money, beefsteak and gravy, Ford in the garage, red, white, and blue job for every man. His fan club, essentially, his political organization, had 5 million followers. And people thought he might be a serious challenge to FDR in the 1936 presidential election when he was shot and killed by his son-in-law, who had become angry when Long had cut the son-in-law out of one of his crooked political schemes. Dr. Francis Townsend was from California, and he had an interesting proposal. Being an older gentleman himself, he said, hey, if we got older people out of the workforce, that would create new jobs for younger people. But older people needed to work. They had to feed themselves. So his plan went like this. You're forced to retire at 65, but the government will give you $200 a month, which today would probably be more like a little over $2,000 a month, to these older Americans, but you had to spend all the money by the end of the month. You couldn't save this money because the point of that money was to stimulate the economy. Saving it wouldn't stimulate the economy. By 1934, these Townsend clubs had 2 million members, pressuring the government to do this. And Long and Townsend make an interesting point, which is the greatest pressure on FDR was not from the right. It wasn't for him to become more conservative. It was for him to go further. Charles Coughlin was another one of these voices. Coughlin was, I said that religion was the most popular thing on the radio, and Coughlin was the most popular religious person on the radio priest. He attacked Wall Street and capitalists. He called for the nationalization of key industries, and he started as one of FDR's biggest boosters. But soon, he had increasing demands for social justice. Then, he became enamored with the ideas of Adolf Hitler. Unfortunately, Coughlin is largely today remembered as a supporter of Hitler. But for a time, he was a major force pushing FDR to go further and further to the left. But religion on the radio was a big deal. The fundamentalists pushed an anti-modern message, even though they were using modern technology to do that, and were able to bypass previous gatekeepers and go straight to the people. This is key to modern political movements. Whenever there is a new technology and communication put out there, whether it's the penny press, which we talked a little bit about, the radio, the television, the internet, whatever it is, the first people to find success in that tend to be, regular people who bypass gatekeepers and begin to push these messages out. And it leads often to political movements, kind of unexpected political movements in many cases. Amy Semple McPherson from Louisiana was the top preacher for the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. And she became a massive star in the 1920s. She did a traveling revival show around the country that drew huge crowds. She had wanted to be in film and created elaborate sets and costumes and used film special effects to enhance her preaching. She disappeared at one point. She was believed to have been drowned. She is apparently on the California coast. She was believed to have been drowned, but then resurfaced several days later looking fairly beat up and her clothes all torn up, and said she had been kidnapped. What had actually happened, reporters slowly revealed, was that she had been having an affair with one of the men that worked with her. She was married. And they had run off and had some sort of extended sexual tryst, and she tried to disguise it as her being kidnapped. This, unfortunately, is kind of the future of these mass media preachers going forward. Now, I don't know how relevant this is to our course, but I cannot tell the story of U.S. history without talking about Dr. John Brinkley and the border blasters, because I just find it fascinating. When America and Canada, they got together and they divided up the radio spectrum. Canada can broadcast on these frequencies, America broadcasts on these frequencies. And this was an issue because they left Mexico out, and Mexico was offended by this. So Mexico just ignored all this and broadcast on whatever frequencies they want. Canada and Mexico had agreed to limit, I believe, the wattage of the transmitters to 10,000 watts. Mexico had no such limitation. Mexico would have much, much more powerful stations. And so people figured out fairly quickly, even if you were from America, that if you went down just across the Mexican border, and you could build a radio tower and you could transmit without an FCC license. There were no rules on what you could broadcast. You could transmit on whatever channel you wanted, as powerful as you wanted. And so that led to the rise of these things called border blasters, like XERA is one of these. And these were incredibly powerful radio stations. Now, the way AM radio, there was no XM radio yet, works is the signal goes much, 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 much further at night. And you could hear these border blasters in all the way deep into Canada. They cover the entire United States. They're actually going to be really important because a lot of music that was kind of looked on with disfavor by mainstream America, like a lot of black music, early rock and roll, even country and western music, a lot of these artists would go down to the border and get on these border blasters. Wolfman Jack is probably the most famous DJ associated with these. And so, young Americans would catch these border blasters on their AM radio, and that's really how rock and roll, and to some extent honky-tonk music, and many black forms of music spread into the American consciousness. If you go read histories of early rock and roll guys, they will almost always talk about listening to some border blaster, which is the first time they heard, Good Rockin' Tonight by Roy Brown, or Rocket 88 by Ike Turner, or technically Jackie Branch and the Delta Cats, which are some of the early rock and roll songs. Now, it wasn't just music, though. John Brinkley was a quack doctor, and I say that with quotes because he wasn't a real doctor, from Kansas. And he came up with a procedure that he said could make infertile men fertile by implanting goat testicles into their scrotums. Soon this became a cure-all. The goat testicles would cure anything. He was beloved in Kansas. And men would come and they would pay him and they'd get this procedure done. Of course, it didn't work, but sometimes he could claim some positive results. But more importantly, he had a big radio show in Kansas. And once he was on the radio, people believed him because, it seemed like a voice of authority. Kansas went after him to shut him down for this quack medicine. And he ran for governor to try to save himself. And he almost won. This prompted false advertising laws, by the way. He responded to this. Well, let me back up. He would eventually become a multimillionaire, but died penniless due to the lawsuits created by this. In 1923, he built the 1,000-kilowatt KFKB in Kansas. When authorities came to arrest him for being a fake doctor, the Kansas governor actually stopped them. Brinkley was too important to the Kansas economy. He would talk for hours every day on a station about these goat glands, and people believed it. He featured a medical letter answering segment, which was really payola for a network of pharmacies that sold his Brinkley-branded snake oil. This generated in 2021 dollars $12 million a year in these fake medicines. In 1930, the FCC denied his radio license renewal. And so he moved down to the border to Acuna, just across the border from Del Rio, Texas. He set up a 1,000,000-watt station, XERA, and began to broadcast. Now he could be heard not just in Kansas, but everywhere. These stations, by the way, were so powerful, it was said that if cars drove by, it would turn on their headlights. They said you could hear these stations in bed springs. You could hear them in the fillings in your teeth and barbed wire fences if you were within a mile or so of the transmitter. He added crazy water crystals, genuine simulated diamonds, life insurance, and religious swag like autographed pictures of Jesus to his advertising bill. Country stars like the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers flocked to Acuna, and he came to be called the Hillbilly Hollywood. When mind readers, fortune tellers, and other mystics were banned by the FCC, they went to Acuna and got on the border blasters. There were 11 of these stations in operation. The new journalism attacked this quackery and launched dozens of lawsuits that would ultimately bankrupt him, though. But these were enormous figures, particularly Brinkley, during the 1930s, that are largely forgotten today.